Šis ir Foruma Celies podkāsts. Mans vārds ir Madara Kanasta, un podkāstā es sarunājos ar cilvēkiem par jautājumiem saistībā ar dzimumu līdztiesību, stereotipiem, veselīgu vīrišķību un sievišķību un dzīvi kopumā. So hello, today's conversation will be done in English because we have an esteemed guest from Canada. And today we will be talking about engaging men and boys into violence prevention and healthy masculinities. And together with me, there is Humberto Carolo. He's an executive director of the White Ribbon Canada organization. And they are working specifically with engaging men and boys into violence prevention and are really well known in all world. And we are happy to have them in a conversation with us today as well. So hi, Humberto.
Hello, Madara. Thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation with you.
How are you today? Just a quick check with you.
I'm good. You know, it's very cold here in just outside of Toronto in Canada, and I'm looking forward to sunnier, warmer days in the springtime. I hope all is well with you as well.
Oh, I believe so. Okay, so this jump to the point. The question for me, the first one to ask is, okay, what is White Ribbon? We have, some might have heard of our listeners and some might have no idea what is it. Can you tell us a bit more about your organization, the history, the values that you're standing for?
Absolutely. So White Ribbon is a community-based organization based in Canada. It started 2 years after the December 6, 1989 Montreal massacre, where 14 women lost their lives. It's an organization that's dedicated to ending all forms of gender-based violence, including violence against women. And so on that day, on December 6, 1989, young men walked into an engineering school, into one of the classrooms. He asked all the men in the room to leave, and then he took out his gun and killed 14 women and injured many others. And he did this because he hated women. He hated feminism. As he was shooting the women, he was yelling, "I hate feminists. I hate women." And he left a long list of about 30 other prominent Canadian women that he wanted to kill. He took his own life before the police arrived. And so this was a very tragic incident in Canadian history. Of course, it happened at a time when we in Canada were talking about the role of women in science and engineering, and the fact that our engineering profession, our schools, and our workplaces were disproportionately missing women. That profession, that area of study was seen, and it still is to a certain degree these days, seen as a male profession, a male area of studies. So this was a tragic incident that led to a lot of soul searching in Canadian society. The question at the time was this an incident, an isolated incident of gun violence, as we so often see in North America, unfortunately, and in particular in schools? Or was this a symptom of a larger issue in our society, which is the discrimination, the systemic inequality that exists between men and women? And was this a reflection of that inequality? Of course, we know what the answer is, that it is in fact incidents like these, and everyday incidents of violence against women are demonstrative of that inequality that exists in our society. And so 2 years after this incident, still in the midst of that conversation, 3 men in Toronto came together, and they felt that men weren't coming forward, weren't thinking of these issues, weren't participating in the conversation. So they came up with the idea of creating the White Ribbon campaign. They came up with a symbol of the White Ribbon. They came up with a pledge to never commit, condone, or remain silent about violence against women. And they encouraged all men and boys to wear the white ribbon as their commitment, as their pledge towards that end. That idea quickly spread out across Canada, North America, and around the world. And today we know that white ribbon campaign initiatives have been organized in over 60 countries around the world. So that's the origins of our organization. We are focused on engaging men and boys to promote gender equality. That's our end goal. And we do that by working with educators, with the media, with community-based organizations, with sports, with government, to strengthen our collective capacity to work with men and boys, to invite men and boys to be part of the solution, to be part of the dialogue, and to engage in their own behavior and attitudinal changes as well. So that's a little bit about White Ribbon.
Thank you. And how did you yourself get involved into this work?
So I've been with the organization for almost 16 years now, and my background was in HIV prevention with vulnerable youth. And I had done some international development work as well in my previous role. So an opportunity came up at White Ribbon to coordinate a Canada-Brazil cooperation project. And because I had had that previous experience, and because of the intersections between gender-based violence and HIV/AIDS, and also because of my language proficiency, I had the opportunity to lead that project. And then just progress from there in my role within the organization, and got involved both at the national and international level of doing this work. But prior to that, I would say that, you know, these issues are personal for me as well, in addition to being of great professional interest to me. They're very personal. I grew up witnessing violence in the home. I witnessed women in my family, in my community, being discriminated against, experiencing violence, different forms of violence. So I grew up with that kind of awareness and that kind of feeling that I wanted to do something about that. I wanted to change the ways in which women are treated. I wanted to change the ways in which families raise their kids, and so that kids like myself in the future didn't have to experience that, so that women like those in my life, in my community, didn't have to go through that kind of experience. So it was a commitment that I made to myself very early on as a young person, that I would dedicate my efforts, my career to addressing this issue. And so I'm a dad as well. I have 3 sons, and I'm very interested in parenting and helping other families, and particular dads, parent differently than I was parented, so that our kids, our new generations, grow up with a better understanding of healthy relationships, with great role models that help grow up understanding consent, and grow up, not living with violence in their homes, in their communities, in their workplaces. So that's a little bit of my background and what makes me connect with and be very committed to working on this issue.
Yeah, it is really interesting for me, like personally and professionally, because this is something that we are doing, trying to engage men into violence prevention in the forums Celies. So, like, just your impressions, maybe what else motivations are behind men who are engaging? How do you approach them? How do you find them? Like, also in White Ribbon, who are they, and what are their motivations to become leaders in this field?
Well, it's often men who have built their empathy and their compassion and their understanding towards these issues, and they men who feel like they can play a positive role in addressing this. Men who, like myself, had those early experiences, or men whose partners, girlfriends, whose peers in the workplace have shared with them their own experiences of violence. So it's about men who've been exposed to these issues and have had an opportunity to learn a little bit about it and want to do more and to see that they can play a role in making a difference. Yeah, it's men who want to do it for, you know, people in their lives, people in their communities, in their workplaces, in their schools, and they are men who believe in human rights and believe that in order for us to advance as a society, in order for us to address some of the more pressing issues in our country, in the globe, that they need to be part of that change, and that they need to work alongside with women and women's organizations, feminist movements, diverse social movements to bring about change. And so there's many motivating factors for men to be involved in this work, and we continue to try to find those entry points. You know, some of it is about leadership in the community, some of it is about being good leaders in the workplace. Some of it is about being good faith leaders and political leaders and wanting to do their part to change this around. So there are many ways in which men can be involved, and we constantly look for opportunities to engage with and help men understand the role that they can play.
And how is it like now in your situation, like in Canadian society in general? Do you find that a lot of men are engaged with these issues? And how is generally with the gender equality and gender-based violence? Well, we know that Canada is way more advanced in these issues if you compare with Latvia, because we are just starting to talk about them. But still, what is the situation? What are still the challenges there?
Well, you know, when it comes to rates of gender-based violence, we find those common rates across the globe, right? We know that just because it's Canada doesn't mean that we don't have violence against women, right? Our stats show that 51% of women over the age of 16 have already experienced one form of sexual or gender-based violence in their life. So it's pretty significant. We know that when it comes to Canada's Indigenous communities, that Indigenous women and girls are disproportionately impacted by gender-based violence and discrimination. We know that to be the case as well with racialized women, with women who are part of the LGBTQ community, with women with disabilities, and women who are unemployed, single women, and so forth. So we know that these issues impact disproportionately women that have multiple intersecting identities and experiences of discrimination and violence. So Canada is no different in that sense. And with the current pandemic, with COVID-19, we too have seen a significant increase in women and children experiencing violence in the homes. We know that those rates have gone up by anywhere between 25 to 30%, depending on the area in Canada. And we know there again that violence is disproportionately experienced by racialized women, by Indigenous women and girls. Some of those rates can be as high as 3, 4, 5 times than in the general population. So that is the situation of gender-based violence in Canada. The government of Canada has taken steps to address this, has put forward supports for women's shelters and women's organizations who are trying to increase their capacity to support women and children. We're also concerned about the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. We wonder if many women are living with this violence without being able to reach out and without being able to get support because of our stay-at-home kind of guidelines, public health guidelines. So we think that once this pandemic is over, there may be a significant increase of women coming forward and accessing support programs at shelters and so forth. So that's in terms of the impact of gender-based violence in Canada. When it comes to engaging men and boys, it's this work has been progressively increasing over time with more awareness and more commitment, more support from everywhere, from government to corporations to the media to cultural and sports organizations. White Ribbon has had an opportunity to do this work over 30 years and engage with very diverse sectors in Canada, from sports organizations to labor associations. We do a lot of work with the education sector, for example, looking at the role of male educators in engaging with boys and young men on these conversations in the classroom, in the school community. But we've also done a lot of work with fathers and with athletes and with faith leaders and with specific cultural communities. We have a really great project right now working with immigrant and refugee communities, looking at the role of immigrant and refugee men and boys in supporting survivors of violence in the community, in speaking out against it, in making sure that men and boys are part of the solution rather than perpetrating violence and discrimination. So it's a work in progress. It's not perfect, but it's something that we're committed to doing, that we believe that we have some really great models that we can build on and that we can scale up right across Canada, and we can share our experiences around the world as well. There's a lot of really great work being done with men and boys around the globe, and there are significant opportunities for us to exchange, to learn from one another, to see what works where and what doesn't work, and to support and to scale up and build on those approaches that have been successful in engaging men and boys. There are a lot of those in Canada, but one of the biggest challenges, of course, is that the support for this kind of work is small scale. We need to do this at a larger scale. We need to involve even more men, even more boys. We need to partner with even more organizations and even more sectors, and we need the resources to do that. And it's still, they're not there still, but we keep working on them. Yeah.
Yeah, totally can relate with the resources and all that. But when I'm listening to what you're telling, that always what comes into my mind is the question and issue that usually you hear when you're working with gender-based violence. Okay, but so what about men? Like, do men also suffer from violence, and what about them? And how do you address these issues?
Well, we talk about how women and girls disproportionately experience violence at the hands of men and boys. If we look at the stats overall, not just in Canada, but around the world, we know that a great percentage of women, like I said, in Canada, 51% over the age of 16 have experienced already one incident of gender-based violence or sexual violence. That's a really high rate, right? And it's predominantly at the hands of men and boys. So 95 to 97% of that violence is committed by men and boys. So that's the reality. Men experience a tremendous amount of violence as well. And that violence is at the hands of men and boys. It's not at the hands of women. So we have to work together to end this violence. And it's important for men to understand that distinction and for men to understand why that violence happens, right? Why women experience a tremendous amount of violence at the hands of men. And that's because of the power imbalances that exist in our society. It's because of systemic discrimination. It's because of the fact that women still don't have access to the same kind of rights and opportunities and advancement and pay and so forth and jobs as men do, in general. And it's if we look at the key roots of this violence, we know that it stems from patriarchy, from that division, again, from that separation between rights and power and decision making for men and for women. So men exert a significant amount of control and dominance over women and girls, but also over other men and boys themselves as well. So when we start addressing the root causes of that violence, that power imbalance, when we start looking at gender norms and stereotypes and the pressures that men live with to conform, to behave in certain ways, to exert that control and dominance, when we start addressing that, we know that we can have a positive impact on the lives of women and girls. Because when men share power, or when men share decision making, when men see women and girls as equals, then they're less likely to use violence and exert control and power over women and girls. But at the same time, they're also less likely to exert violence and control and dominance over other men as well. So all of this to say that it's in all of our interests to end this inequality and to end this violence. And it's one of the many conversations that we have with men about, is to help them understand those dynamics. Because we kind of come into this world, we are raised, we live our life without really even realizing that those dynamics exist, that those differences exist. It's not until we actually sit down and have those conversations with adult men, with boys and young men, and help them understand those gender stereotypes and those dynamics, that they start to realize that that their lives are impacted by this, that they too are at risk potentially of using control and dominance and of using power to dominate over women and girls, and also over men and boys, and that they too may experience that control, that power, and that domination, that violence at the hands predominantly of other men and boys themselves.
I'm glad you mentioned that. This really comes in, and then it really comes into my mind the term of man box that you mentioned also in the training we had. Could you a bit explain to the listeners who were not in the training and might not have heard about that? Like, what is man box and what is the life in it?
Yeah, so the men box is a set of gender stereotypes that men experience, right? So it is narrowly defined. When we think about what it means to be a real man, we can all think of certain stereotypes that come to mind, right? So a real man is tough, is strong. A real man always fights back, never backs down. A real man is sure about their control. They're always in control. They're decision makers. They have power. They are, sexperts. They they're studs when they have multiple sex partners. They're the boss. They are supposed to like sports. They're, when you think of a real man in terms of what they physically look like, they're muscular and tall, and they have a lot of strength and so forth. There are so many stereotypes there, and also those stereotypes also go into, for example, the kinds of professions or roles that men play in society and in the workplace. Men are the decision makers at work. They're the bosses. They're the executives. They're the CEOs of companies. And men get into engineering professions, right? If you think about the stereotypical male-dominated professions, you think about engineering, lawyers, doctors, and mathematicians, technical professions, and so forth. Conversely, when you think about, what a real woman is supposed to be like, in stereotypical terms, you can find very, very similar kind of stereotypes, but contrary to what the stereotypes are assigned to men, that women are vulnerable, they're emotional, right? They tend to get into caring professions. They're the mothers, they do the cooking, the cleaning, they're the nurses, they're the primary school teachers, they're the secretaries, and so forth and so forth, right? So that is what we call the gender box, and when it comes to men, it's called the man box. So those are the norms and stereotypes that we grow up with, that we live with, that we don't even realize that impact us, or that we live by that man box, right? Until we have an opportunity to think differently, until someone has a conversation with us and talks about, for example, emotional intelligence, the fact that it's important to talk about our feelings, not to express our anger through violence, that there's other ways of expressing angers by talking about what's upsetting us, and so forth. And so that is the main the man box. And for many men who don't fit, who are not able to live within that man box, they experience a great deal of ostracization as well, bullying, name calling, the use of homophobic words like wuss and gay and so many others, when they don't fit that kind of stereotypical image of what a quote unquote real man is supposed to look like. So men are pressured right back into that box when they try to step outside of it. And we know that these pressures come from media, come from the workplace, from our leaders, from culture, from our upbringing, from our parents, from our schools, and so much more. So that is the dynamic that many boys and young men end up growing up with, and this is why it's so important for us to do the work that we do, because we help to deconstruct that man box, and we help men and boys in particular understand the impact that those harmful norms and those gender stereotypes have on the lives of women and children who are on the receiving end of those behaviors, and on other men as well who also experience those behaviors. As I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of violence and control and dominance that men experience is at the hands of other men, right? So that is another consequence of that man box. But we also help men understand the impact that set of stereotypes and harmful norms have on their own lives as well, right? If we are taught from a young age that we're not supposed to cry, that sharing emotions and talking about our feelings is not a man thing, that's a woman's thing. If we think that in order to be a grown man, a strong man, that we have to hold in our feelings, that we have to always control and dominate and show, everybody the way and never back down and always fight back and all of that. We can start thinking about the impact that has on our own mental health and mental well-being, right? If we're human beings, expressing emotions is natural. It's a human thing to do. So when we're not able to do that, and when we're pressured or feel pressured to not do that, then it has significant impacts on our own lives as well. And that's where men start to resort to risk-taking behaviors, to alcohol, to drugs, to violence, to anger, and so forth. And as a result of having to find ways to live within that box. But it can be so much more healthy and so much more liberating to step outside of that box and to start learning about how to express feelings in healthy ways, how to seek help when needed, how to view strength as not just physical strength, but strength of character, and how to think about compassion and empathy as male traits as well, and how we can apply that to our lives and our relationships with our loved ones, with people that we work with, the people that we learn with and engage in the community with, and in general, empathy and compassion is what leads us to also feel and believe that we can be part of this movement, of this a call to promote gender equality, to play our role in promoting gender equality, and to end and to speak out against all forms of gender-based violence.
You already mentioned, but okay, what else aspects? What are the steps or things I can do to, to get out of the man box? Because when I'm, for example, listening to you, I realized, oh yeah, that's something that is affecting my life as well. But what do I do? How do I get out of it? How do I make my life more healthy then?
Well, the first step is to learn about this issue, right? Because like I said, this is ingrained into our upbringing, right? I remember as a boy when I was, 6, 7, 8 years old, I was very often told to stop crying, right? I was a very sensitive kid. And I cried very easily for any reason. And why not, right? It's kids, children, adults. So it's part of our emotions. It's how we deal with our emotions. We're sad, we're upset, we cry. Great. But in my case, and in many boys' cases, my family, some of my family members would tell me to stop crying, to grow up. Boys, grown men don't cry, right? So we grow up with those kinds of pressures and those kinds of stereotypes, and our parents, our family members, they don't do it deliberately. They too grew up like that. They too, these stereotypes, these harmful norms are passed on from generation to generation. So we have to break that cycle. We have to learn about it. So I encourage all men to read up on emotional literacy, right? Find out what it's about. Read up on emotions. What are some healthy emotions and what are not so healthy emotions, and how can we better express our emotions, and join a group, start working with Marta Center, join your forum and learn about these issues. I certainly did. One of the things that I did, when I got into my senior years of high school and university, because I was so interested in this area of work and studying and so forth, I started getting involved and started doing volunteer work, with my high school at university, and started getting engaged, involved with groups that dealt with these issues, right? And started taking on roles in promoting human rights and organizing events to engage with other students and community members and so forth. So I learned a great deal about these issues as a result of doing that, So volunteering is one way, reading up, researching. If men are becoming parents, or they're thinking about parenting, and read up, come on our website, check out, our Boys Don't Cry campaign. There's some really great resources there on how to parent with emotional literacy, how to engage with boys and young men, how to have conversations about gender equality and ending gender-based violence. So that helps. Taking those steps will help, because that helps to develop our own understanding and helps us gain the confidence and the ability to break out of that box. Because it's hard once you start expressing emotions, then you're going to have all of those outside influences, right, that kind of pressure you to get back into that man box. But the more we learn about it, the more we understand, the more we practice, the better equipped we will be to reject those pressures and to be able to say, no, I'm going to be my authentic self. If I cry, I'm going to be okay crying. If I need to seek help, then that's being strong. I need to do something to make my life, my mental health, my relationships, my links with my children, the way that I work with my coworkers even better, right? So learning about it and kind of trying and practicing some of those things will help us build our own confidence and start to change our own lives around. And then we can start role modeling that for the young people around us as well, which is really important, right? So a dad, parents who can demonstrate to their kids healthy expressions of emotion. We can say it's okay to cry. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay to be upset. It's okay to be angry, but here's some ways in which we can deal with anger. Let's talk about what's upsetting you. Let's open up, right? Which for many men it's so difficult to do. So these are just some ways. Practice makes perfect in this kind of case, and start small and start trying out a couple of different emotions. Start practicing opening up and sharing what's bothering you. At the end of the day, call up a friend or talk to your partner, spouse, or to your family member or to your kids. Role model what it's like to open up and talk about our feelings, right? So those are some things that that people can do, men in particular can do.
Mm. Well, when you were talking, something came to my mind. Well, in Latvia, there are some men's groups. The initiative of some men's groups are starting to show up. But as far as I know, their approach has been mostly more talking about this from this psychoanalysis point of view, about initiation, about the roles that men play through the psychoanalysis aspects. What are your thoughts about that? Like, is it something that is also popular in Canada? Do you do that? Have you had experience with these initiation type of men's groups?
We haven't, and in some, seeking help, professional help, seeing a counselor, a psychologist, or a psychotherapist, or a social worker, there's nothing wrong with that, right? Sometimes that outside help is needed, and it makes a real difference. Joining groups absolutely can be helpful. It can help build connections. It can help men understand from one another. Men can share their experiences, their challenges, and again, role model that kind of change and that kind of commitment. However, we must be careful in how that's done, because in some cases, with some approaches that exist out there, that men are engaged with a very stereotypical kind of approach. It's like the men box, the use of the men box to get men to open up, and it may not be the most healthy thing to do. So telling men to toughen up and show emotions, or put men through some sort of physical, hard labor, kind of experience in order to get them to open up, it may not be the best approach. And I know that there are some frameworks that exist that are out there, and that we in this field of engaging men and boys do not necessarily subscribe to, because you can't use one form of oppression to fight another, right? You can't use the men box to get men to change. You can't use harmful norms and stereotypes as a way to get men to see their life differently or view their life differently, by exerting those kinds of stereotypes and those kinds of harmful norms on men themselves as a technique. That I don't believe that that's effective, and it can actually cause more harm than good.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for this. I've been also thinking about these issues, of course, not being involved myself, so it's hard to think about to like evaluate it. But we did have a conversation some years ago with David Robinson, who's also from Canada, and he's one of the leaders in this field. So he was talking a lot about this initiation and this process.
Yeah. Well, it would be like, let me give a more concrete example. For example, it would be like getting men to enroll in the military in order to become more emotionally intelligent, to harden them up and to strengthen their, I mean, there is a role for the military to play, of course, but we know that, those male-dominated kind of settings and frameworks are often what put men inside that box, after all, right? When you think of the stereotype of a soldier, you don't think of a man who easily expresses their emotion and opens up and talks about feelings and so forth. Instead, when you think of a soldier, what comes to mind is that stoic, strong, never afraid, never shows any sign of weakness kind of stereotype, right? So some of these frameworks of engaging with men around these issues use that kind of military style approach, and it's just not effective. Yeah.
Thanks for this. Well, what else I wanted to ask you is, I know that you're really, you and White Ribbon in general, you are really involved into global issues regarding men's and boys' engagement into violence prevention. You are participating in big conferences, talking everywhere, and so on. And so, what maybe you could share, what are the trends and issues now currently on the global agenda that people are talking about and people are trying to focus on?
Yeah, there's a great deal of interest on intersectionality nowadays. So looking at, for example, climate change and gender equality, looking at gender-based violence and militarism, looking at racism and gender equality, right? So when it comes to engaging men and boys, that provides for some interesting entry points through which we can have some meaningful conversations, lots of meaningful conversations with men and boys. So one of the interests out there at a global level is, how do we do that? How do we work through those entry points, and how do we break down those silos and build greater solidarity and empathy and compassion and collaboration across movements? So that's one. The other one is that gender-based violence, is something that is present in almost every society. Vast majority of societies over time have experienced, have seen different forms of gender-based violence. So, there's also the need to think about men's involvement in, for example, ending early and forced child marriage, in ending female genital mutilation, the role of men and boys in ending the spread of HIV, in addressing sexual health and rights, and so those are some of the key topics right now. And the intersections between racism and gender-based violence, again, there's an opportunity to talk about allyship there, to talk about the impact of racism on racialized communities, on Black men and women, trans women in particular, who are disproportionately impacted by gender-based violence and discrimination. So intersectionality, again, is real key. And for us, doing this work with men and boys, it's about learning how to work through those different intersections and how to bring into the conversation, into the behavior change, into the systemic change, the need to work side by side with anti-racist and feminist and women's rights movements. There's also a great deal of interest too in decolonizing our practices, right? In looking at how, for example, the global North works with the global South, and ensuring that the global North and our practices in the global North are not necessarily seen as the be all and end all to engaging men and boys in these issues. There's a need to look at, some of the initiatives, some of the promising and best practices in the global South as perhaps examples for the global North to take on as well. There's also the subject of accountability. As we do this work with men and boys, we need to keep in mind the end goal of this work, which is the promoting of gender equality. It's about to redress discriminations and historical discriminations. It's about looking at those intersections and making sure that as we are encouraging men to promote gender equality, that alongside we're encouraging men to promote racial justice, promote rights for Indigenous people, promoting LGBTQ rights and respect and all of that. So it's that is very, very important, so accountability to the women's movement, but also to the diverse social movements is key in this work. We cannot end gender-based violence without ending racism, without ending colonialism and homophobia and transphobia and ableism and so forth, because otherwise the people who have those multiple identities will continue to experience violence in one way or another, right? So we can't end gender-based violence without addressing those systems of discrimination. So it's a lot of work, it's hard work. We're talking about the long run, but we're also fortunate, and I think we need to be grateful for movements like the Me Too movement, right? The Black Lives Matter movement, the Indigenous land and rights movements, the LGBTQ rights movements, and so forth, because it helps to bring to the surface people's experiences with discrimination and violence. It helps to build understanding and compassion and empathy, and it helps us kind of jump into action, to stand in solidarity, to do our part, to be good allies, and to do the hard work of changing minds, hearts, and everything when it comes to these issues. Yeah.
Mm. Okay, so I see it's a lot of work. It's not only about masculinities, it's way more than mostly about human rights and gender in general. And yeah, that is something maybe that we are struggling here in Latvia as well, because a lot of issues are still so new in our public discourse. We are not really talking about them. And it's always tricky to start a conversation about when you're trying to focus on masculinities, but there are still way many more issues to combine it with, and sometimes it's a bit tricky and scary to put it on the agenda.
Yeah,
so, yeah,
it is hard work, and it takes it takes courage, and it takes resolve and commitment. But I believe when we start taking small steps, and when we start having conversations with men from the heart about these issues, when we start helping men understand the impact of these issues on their communities, on their families, on themselves, when we start talking about the historical impacts and historical experiences of discrimination, then I think it is possible to turn this around. I think it is possible for men to be compassionate, and to understand empathy, and to understand that they can play a positive role on this, even if some of these issues are considered difficult, taboo. There may be still laws and practices, in our countries that are discriminatory, that don't encourage us to have these conversations. We still need to find ways to do it, and to start small, because that's how social movements start, right? The Me Too movement, it took a few courageous women to come forward, to set the example, and then all of a sudden we had, a flood of people coming forward with their experiences as well. So we need to take inspiration from those movements and think that we can do it ourselves too. The White Ribbon Campaign is an example of that, right? It was 3 men that came up with this idea. So it is possible if we think about the change that we can make, at our within our sphere of influence. If we start thinking about ways to invite others to be part of the conversation, to be part of the efforts with us, then we can quickly realize that we can make a difference. Yeah.
Well, not to keep you too long, I will ask you one more, like the last question, the main question maybe. So what are your suggestions? What are the main steps, like easier or harder ones, that a man can step and do to become allies, to become like both, like maybe how to practically, maybe what are your suggestions how to react when you hear a sexist joke, or how do you approach I don't know, a situation on the street? How do you become an ally in this regard?
Well, first and foremost, learn about these issues, read about it, talk to organizations like Marta Center, right? And visit the White Ribbon website. There's a lot of information there on how to become an ally and what you can do in your different spheres of life, right? Whether it be as a father or as a co-worker, or as a leader, or as an athlete, or as an educator. Learn about these issues, listen to women, listen to survivors. I think that's really important, and listen without judgment, listen with empathy and compassion, and practice practice empathy. So when you're listening to people's stories of violence, of discrimination, empathize, tell them that they didn't deserve to experience that the person who caused harm didn't have the right to do that. That's a way of showing empathy, right? Ask the person, what can I do to support you? And then listen and follow their guidance, because ultimately it's about their experience and you're there to be an ally and to support. In our everyday life, we encourage men to take steps to address behaviors or attitudes or jokes that they witness. But it's best to, again, learn about it first, learn about what are some of the effective ways in which we can intervene as a bystander, because sometimes it's very complicated. If it's a joke, in a social setting, one of the simplest things that men can do is say, that's not funny. And they can just leave it at that and change the subject. They can walk away and say, that's not funny. They can ask the person who told the joke, that they can say something like, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you just said. Can you explain it to me? I don't know what you mean by that, right? And give the person an opportunity to explain that joke, because it will get a little awkward and they'll have to explain it, and you kind of play along feeling like, oh, I'm not sure I understand what you mean by this. And then it provides an opening opportunity to have a conversation, right? Which is not, perhaps not as reactive, that perhaps is more open. So show some curiosity. Sometimes that works really well when you're having conversations with friends, or when the joke is coming from a family member, for example, and just insist on understanding, where are they coming from, and tell me more about this, and then challenge, right? And then say, and then express your feeling as to why you feel that this is a sexist joke, or misogynist joke, or racist, or homophobic, or so forth, right? So take steps like that. In some cases, it's not possible. If it's a person of authority, for example, it may be very awkward to have to challenge the person right on the spot. So you may want to have a conversation with them later on privately. You may want to look at the code of conduct for the employer or the organization that you belong to, and in some cases, it may be necessary to report an incident. And if the joke is directed at another person, check in with that person as well. Again, tell them, I'm sorry that this has happened. You didn't deserve that. That was not an appropriate thing to say or to do. Is there anything I can do to support you? So there are many ways of intervening. If it's a situation of violence, if there's a great deal of conflict going on and you're witnessing this and you feel like I need to do something about it, you need to consider the safety, any safety risks. And if there's violence happening, if there's a weapon of some kind, of course, you need to call the police and not get involved. But then if possible, you can check in with the person that experienced that violence afterwards. But first and foremost, make sure that you use an attitude of wanting to be part of the solution, laughing along, participating, ignoring, telling your own jokes is not a form of allyship. It's not a form of challenging these behaviors from happening. So we have to do our part. We have to role model as well for others around us. Yeah. So those are just a few things that can be done. There's a lot more. But taking some small steps, practicing. It's hard to do this. Sometimes people are afraid of what may happen. They may be afraid of the violence or the negative attention being turned on them. And so it can be cause for concern. But this is where practicing makes perfect. And the more you practice, the more you become confident. And the more likely you'll be able to intervene effectively and successfully in more complex kind of situations. So start small, start with jokes and move from there.
Okay, thank you. So I see there are like two aspects, starting small and practicing. That is something to focus on. And none of us start perfectly. We will make mistakes. We will sometimes not be able to get involved, and sometimes we will feel too awkward. But it's important to keep that in mind and keep these issues in mind. Yeah.
And learn about it first. It's really important. One of the most challenging aspects of this is to realize that what has happened is inappropriate in the first place. And for many men, that realization is not there. And that's why it's so important to learn about the issues first, because then you'll be better equipped to identify jokes or situations that require intervening, that require a form of demonstration of allyship. And then you'll know how to do that effectively as well.
Okay, thank you. A lot of interesting stuff to think about. I won't hold you any more longer. So thank you for the conversation. And
my pleasure. Thank you, Madar, and thank you for the work that you do and the work that Marta Center does. And we're really happy to support that work and to collaborate with you on initiatives like this. So thank you for the invitation. It was a great conversation and I really enjoyed it.
Paldies, ka klausījies! Tiekamies citreiz!